There is fantasy, high fantasy, low fantasy, mid fantasy, there is post-apocalyptic, there are fairy tales, science fiction, and any other genre you can think of. Superheroes even. But if you ask me who makes the best horror supplements, the answer is almost always going to be Monte Cook Games. Hi there fellow roleplayers and game masters, my name is Mr. Trask, and today I want to talk about 3 books by Monte Cook Games that are just good and proper horror. Now, there's much more horror out there for 5th edition, for other tabletop RPGs. There's a lot of very good horror out there, and I've been reviewing horror supplements ever since I started my channel, and I've even written one horror supplement called Isle of the Dreaded Accursed for both the Cypher system and 5th edition. But if somebody asks me who makes the best horror supplements, which company, which set of writers, which set of artists, writers, which group of people makes the best horror supplements, the answer is almost always going to be Monte Cook Games. So what I want to do in this video is just briefly talk about 3 of their best horror supplements, horror books that they put out in recent history. And if you then find yourself interested in one of these books, you can click the video that belongs to that book and watch my full review of said book. Now, before you're like, wait a second, these are all for the Cypher system and I play 5th edition or Pathfinder or whatever other RPG and I don't want to get into the Cypher system, so this video is not for me. A word about the Cypher system. Now, first of all, 2 of the books in this video have the Cypher system rules in them, so you don't need to buy anything else. You can just buy the book and play, because the Cypher system is built in a way that you can start playing in like 10 minutes, especially if you watch my 5-minute video where I explain the Cypher system in 5 minutes. Also, the Cypher system is incredibly good for things like horror, and I've been asked a lot why. Like, why is it good for horror? Like, you keep saying that, Mr. T, but why? And I've been thinking about that a lot, and I think it is due to its focus on more narrative gameplay. And I think horror stories, like proper vampire stories, zombie stories, that kind of stuff, they just focus a little bit more on the narrative side. There is combat, all of that stuff is in there, but it's just like more mechanics that focus on the narrative side of gameplay. Easy to grasp, easy to expand on without breaking any rules. You can just like make something up without breaking another rule in the Cypher system, and that is why I think even if you play other tabletop RPGs, it's well worth picking up one of these books, because 2 of them have the Cypher system rules. The first book that I want to talk about does not have the Cypher system rules in it. It is one of the white books by Monte Cook Games by the name of Stay Alive. As you can see on my Monte Cook Games shelf, which is not nearly all of my Monte Cook Games books, there's a lot more of them, they have a bunch of these white books, and every white book tackles a genre. There's a superhero book, there's a fairy tale book, there is a fantasy book, there's a sci-fi book, there's a book for everything, and there is a book for horror. Also, this book is the most generic of the 3, meaning that this does not have one particular theme. This is a book that gives you tools and methods and rules and optional rules and tool sets to create better horror in your games. So if you own the Cypher system rulebook, or you own a copy of the Cypher system basic rules, and you want to start playing the Cypher system, even if it's for like 3 or 4 sessions, and you want to build a proper good horror story, horror campaign, or whatever, in whatever horror genre you can think of, everything is being tackled in this book. There's clown horror, blob horror, there's zombies, there's post-apocalyptic stuff in there, there's vampires, all of that stuff. I don't know, there's much more. It has like this crazy high school kids being slaughtered kind of thing. There's all kinds of crazy horror in here, and mummies, there's mummies horror in here. So every genre of horror almost you can think of is in here. Now, that said, There is a campaign in here, a mini campaign. It's just like a bunch of adventures that will take you a few sessions in here, but it is a vampire campaign. If you're not into vampires, that part of the book probably won't interest you. That said, it is really good. I've never been into vampires, and I say this in my review video of this book. I've never been into vampires. Like, I don't like vampires. Even in Dungeons and Dragons, like vampire adventures or whatever, or like Twilight or Ravenloft or Dracula movies, I I fucking hate vampires, but I love the vampire mini campaign that is in here. But I would get this book, and I own this book, and have this book, and use this book for the tool set. There is this, they call it the, I'm just gonna peek really quickly, they call it the Encyclopedia of Horror Mechanics. What they have in here is an entire encyclopedia of all kinds of different mechanics you can introduce to your Cypher System game. You can even introduce some of them to your 5th edition game if you want to, but you can introduce these to your Cypher System game and make your game feel more horror. There's different ways of your characters not being able to heal up. There's madness rules. There is rules for like the horror elements, like when somebody rolls a 1 or a 2, you have these rules. Normally, if somebody rolls a 1, normally if somebody rolls a 1, you have like a GM intrusion, but then it happens on a 1 and a 2 or a 3 and a 4, but it only goes up when something happens. There's all kind of like different rule sets for different games, and you can just pick and choose these rule sets. Hallucination reset, horror modes, instant panic, hysteria, last survivor, madness, perilous venture, poor choices, possession, secret twist. All rules for you as a game master to make your horror campaign better. On top of that, like almost any Monte Cook Games book, it has monsters, a lot of horror monsters. So it's a bestiary, it's a GM guide, and it's a mini campaign, all centered around the different genres of horror. Like even slasher horror is in here, which really creeps me out. So I would recommend this book to game masters who are not looking for one particular thing. They're not looking for a book that tackles one subject or one storyline or one campaign or one feeling or whatever. It is for game masters who are looking for a toolbox. And the white books are toolboxes for you as a game master to put those elements of that genre into your game. You don't need to have a horror genre in order to use this book, a horror game in order to use this book. For example, you might have a fantasy game, but then your players end up in a dungeon where there's like a lot of zombies and other foul creatures in there, and you just want some horror elements in that part of the campaign. That is where this book comes into play really nicely. The next one I want to talk about is Old Gods of Appalachia, which is one of my favorite RPG books ever. It is a 10 out of 10. It's a Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild of RPG books. It is really that good. But it is completely different from the white book. It is completely different from anything else. Old Gods of Appalachia is based in and around an alternate history of the Appalachian region in the United States of America. It's a real region, it's a mountainous region, and it is, I say it's an alternate history kind of thing, but it is also based on stories that actually are circling around. The Appalachian region is a region that actually interests me a lot ever since I heard about it from this book and said podcast. I really want to go there. I have this old Volkswagen van that I travel with, and I maintain it myself and I work on it. And one of my big goals and big dreams is taking it, putting it on a shipping container, dropping it in the United States of America, driving to Appalachia, driving there for like 3 or 4 weeks, and then if I survive and don't get eaten by, like, I don't know, spooky school children who have been dead for 40 years, I will go back to Belgium. Now, the reason that the region started interesting me is because Old Gods of Appalachia, the role-playing game, is based on Old Gods of Appalachia, the podcast. Now, if you're into horror and you've never listened to the Old Gods of Appalachia podcast, please get in your car, put on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcasts, start driving to a random direction and start listening. It is insanely creepy, insanely good, insanely well told. Its production value is so high. It has millions of listeners, and Monte Cook Games decided to base an RPG on it, and that is this one. This one has everything. everything you need. You only need this book in order to play a full-on campaign of like 60 years inside and around the Appalachian region, because it has types, it has descriptors, new foci, it has monsters in here, an entire campaign storyline thing, region descriptions of different towns, there's mini adventures in here, the entire Cypher system rules are in here, so you don't even need the Cypher system rulebook, you could just need this book. I mean, there is creating your character, types, descriptor, foci, currency, how to play the game, which is the rules. There's like, I don't know, getting to know Appalachia, Pennsylvania, Kentucky, North Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, and West Virginia, running the game, so tips and tricks for the game master. There's 2 adventures in here, and then there's more like extra information, and all scattered around like almost 400, I think it's, no, more than 400 pages of pure horror in and around the Appalachian region. Now, the type of horror that Old Gods of Appalachia is, I would classify it as the kind of suggestive horror. There's more stuff you feel than stuff you actually go through, if you know what I mean. It's kind of like the first half of Jaws, where you don't really see the shark. You know it's there, there's stories of a shark, and it's there, and it's just like swimming around, but you don't really see it. It's like in Jurassic Park, the horror starts like halfway, if you don't count, of course, that scene where that guy like gets eaten in like the first part of the movie. The actual horror actually starts in the last half of the movie, which is more suggestive horror, and that is Old Gods of Appalachia. So the Appalachian region, basically, I'm gonna completely murder it and simplify it, so if you're from that region or super interested in that region, I'm sorry, but basically this is a region where a lot of like mining companies and everything came, and everybody had to go, like everybody who lived in this region had to go into these mines, and so these regions, these villages and everything became really popular, and people were doing well for themselves, and then suddenly these coal mines and all that kind of stuff closed down, and now there's all of these spooky mines and secrets that have been buried underground, and there's all these stories, and these stories are actually in the Appalachian region in real life, where the mining has awakened some beasts that have been living under the ground for thousands or millions of years. There's school children that went into a freaking mine and never came out, but every time you go near that mine, you hear the sound of school children, but they're nowhere to be found. That kind of creepy horror. So who's this for? Well, for a group of people or a GM who wants a game in and around a real-world region that based on stories from that world, based on a podcast from those stories from that world, that is pure suggestive horror with real creepy elements, with school children being lost and zombies coming out of the ground and trees being alive and that kind of stuff, in and around a creepy, interesting, cool region like Appalachia. And also, if you don't own the Cypher system rules, they're in here, so you have everything. Now, if you're more into the investigation type horror, the Magnus Archives is really for you. The Magnus Archives is also a RPG based on a podcast. I started listening to the podcast, and the podcast is, yet again, great. It is basically the same thing as Old Gods of Appalachia in terms of it is a big book that has a Cypher system rules, it has foci, classes, everything you need, monsters, adventures, and all of that stuff. But then it's just for an entirely different podcast, the Magnus Archives. The Magnus Archives is one of the most original ideas in podcasts that I've ever heard, and also this book might be my biggest surprise, one of my biggest surprises of last year, because I got this delivered, and at first I didn't really look at it. I was like, yeah, you know, I'm not really into that. Like, this is like, I don't know, too modern day, I don't mean like modern day, like today modern day, but like modern day, like with like the tape recorder and that type of stuff. But then I started reading it and I started listening to the podcast, and it is really, really great. Now, the main idea of the Magnus Archives is that there is a building somewhere in the world, and you can decide where it is, or there's maybe 2 or 3 of them on different places in the world, where they collect stories from people who think they went through something supernatural or witnessed something supernatural or whatever. So what these people do is, if they cannot go to the cops because they don't believe them or whatever kind of thing, they write a letter to the Magnus Archives. And these archives, like the Magnus Institute, that's basically what it's called, the Magnus Institute. And then all of these letters are kind of like read out loud into a tape, whatever, and that's put into archives. So you have this archive full of supernatural kind of weird stuff that happened to people in the modern day, right? And it's kind of like the Ghostbusters in a way, where you think you saw a ghost, or you saw a ghost, and then you go to the cops, and the cops are like, ghosts. There's no ghosts. And then you go to the Ghostbusters and they actually help you out. So you as a character, if you play a character, you actually play as one of the archivists, is that a word? One of those lore keeper people who are part of the Magnus Institute, and you basically take out one case, one thing, you listen to the tape, or you read the letter, like from the person that went through that, and then you start investigating. And you can go to those people's houses, or their daughter, or their son, or their father. You can go to the area, and you start to tie knots together to find out what actually happened. Again, this is more of the investigation, suggestive type horror, which is really cool for people who are not necessarily into those hardcore combat focused RPGs, and they're more into like that narrative storytelling where they have a lot of control over what happens, and you as a game master are good at adapting what happens to what the players think is going to happen, which makes the Magnus Archives absolutely a must-buy for people who are into that kind of stuff. If I would play this, I ran it once, but if I would play this or run it again, I would definitely 100% put this in a, I don't know, a 50s, 60s, 70s London, something like that. I just think London and the Magnus Archives go together, I don't know, like coffee and orange juice. I actually really like coffee and orange juice, I'm sorry. And yes, those are 3 of my favorite horror supplements by the same company, Monte Cook Games. 2 of them have everything you need to start playing. They have the Cypher System rules, classes, foci, everything you need, monsters, adventures, mini campaigns, locations. It's complete campaign settings to just start playing. The other one is more a tool set to add horror elements to your game, which is absolutely brilliant if you have a fantasy campaign or a superhero campaign or whatever, and you just want some horror elements added to your game. If you want to pick one of these up, there are affiliate links in the description below. If you decide to pick one up, either in PDF, physical, whatever, I get a couple of bucks if you do that. And until next video, bye bye.